at how to render things to make them look huge. So we're going to look at rendering for distance. In the last video, we looked at rendering for macro in Houdini. In this video, we'll look at some render settings for making things look like they're huge. I wanted to start with this clip from District 9 here, because one of the things that's really successful about the kind of mech and armor and stuff was how well it used scale and how believable it is in the space. And when we look at this, they've pretty successfully made this 3D model appear to be the size of a city through a few specific effects. One is its comparison to things that we have an understanding of. We can look at this door over here on the left, and we know that that door is sized for a human, sized for somebody like us. And so we can imagine ourselves in this space. We don't necessarily know the exact size of this building, but we can infer from the size of the door about how big this building is. And we can look at the distance, and we can look at this size of this ship up here floating over the city, and imagine just how big this ship is in comparison to everything else in the scene. Similarly, we're looking up at the ship. We're not looking down at it. And that's another thing in camera angle that tells us how big something is. Typically, when we're looking up at something, that means that our eye level is lower than the top of the object that we're looking at. And that's clear here in the mech suit that we're looking up at. Our eye level is actually about crotch level for this machine, and we're looking up at its face. That tells us that it's larger than us. And then last, and perhaps most importantly, is this sense of atmospheric perspective, that with the distance, things tend to fade towards kind of a gray-blue in Earth's atmosphere. And so by fading all of this out, making the ship kind of grayish blue, they've told us that it's very, very far away, and that if we were up close to it, it would appear, obviously, large, huge, massive. But the fact that we can see it at all, that it's this size and it's faded out, tells us that it's very, very far away and very, very big. So those are some of the things that you'll want to look for when you're rendering, that you'll want to try to set up when you're trying to render for size. So let's jump into Houdini here. Now, we're not going to set anything up that's quite that dramatic or that detailed for the sake of time, but there's some things that we can quickly drop in here. So first I'm going to drop in our test geometry. So I'm going to go ahead and add a geo object. We'll call this our character. And we'll use one of the test crag guys again, just like we did in the macro photo. So again, same guy. I'm going to go ahead and jump back up here to our object level. And in the object level, I'm also going to add some terrain. And for that, I'm going to use what's called a height field. And a height field by itself doesn't do anything. If I put the spacebar and jump out here, we can see that it's really, really huge. This is essentially going to be our landscape, and we can kind of see how big this character is in comparison to it. But if I open it up, grab the height field, and then add a height field noise, we can kind of start to distort this. And there are tons and tons of things that we can do in Houdini with height fields and making very, very realistic procedural landscapes. And we're just going to barely scratch the surface of it here with this height field noise object. But you can kind of tweak the settings here and see how the amplitude and element size and all this stuff affects it. I'm just going to take the octaves down slightly so it's not quite so bumpy. Maybe we'll boost it back up just a bit. But for the sake of time, again, I'm just going to kind of leave it at the base. And you can kind of mess around with the different settings. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do with simulations of erosion and masking and just all sorts of stuff you can do with height fields. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab crag here, and we want to figure out where to position this. What's going to be a good composition for our camera? So I can kind of pan around here and see what looks good. I think I want to put the city probably at the base of this big mountain. The mountain is going to give us a sense of scale. We'll kind of position that on the thirds there. And just find a good little hill for Crag to stand on. Probably about like here on this little hill. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Crag over towards us. I'm going to grab the character here. Just kind of look at where that hill is. And we'll hit T to get our transform tools. And we'll bring Crag over like that. And just kind of position him over the hill. I'm going to go ahead and scale Crag up just a little bit so that he's a little bit easier to see and a little bit easier to work with. Now again, we want Crag to look large. We want him to look like he could wreck a building potentially. So we're going to go ahead and scale Crag up quite a bit here. Now we'll go ahead and kind of drop him in place on this little hill. So it's a little bit too far down into the hill, so we'll just kind of move him up a little bit so he's kind of standing on the hill like that. And now we want to place our camera. So we want to go ahead and create a camera. And before we place it, I'm also going to go ahead and set the camera's focal length here. So I'm going to set this to 35. This is kind of a good cinematic focal length. Next, I'm going to go ahead and select the camera, Cam 1. So it's a little bit easier to position it like this, just roughly. Make sure the little lock is turned on so that we can actually kind of zoom around. Using our keyboard shortcuts, we'll zoom up here and look at Crag and then kind of rotate around. I'll place Crag on the left side of the composition. Now it's hard to kind of get a real precise camera position like this, so I'm going to go ahead and switch into my camera move attributes. I'm going to split this view up. So let's go ahead and unlock this and rotate out so we get a regular perspective view. And now I'll go ahead and split this up, and then on the bottom one I'll set that to look through Cam 1. Now with Cam 1 selected, I'm going to just turn on the little handles here so we can move it around. And you can go ahead and pull this focal point out a little bit. We can move it a little bit closer to Crag, and if we want, we can at a bit wider angle. So I'm just gonna try like 30 instead, so it's a little bit wider. We just get a little bit more control. We can track in a little bit more with this. Now, something too, since we want Crag to look large, we want the camera to be a little bit lower than him, and we want it to look up just slightly. And I'm going to go ahead and move it over just a little bit. I'm going to make sure that the camera is a little bit lower than Crag, kind of at his waistline here. And then in the distance, we'll go ahead and put the city. So we've kind of established a story here that Crag is marching off to go wreck a city of some sort. So that's pretty much it for positioning of our camera and our character. We don't really need to get into setting up depth of field, because with something grand like this, with landscape, typically everything is going to be in focus. You're going to have a really long depth of field. So I'm going to go ahead and leave depth of field off for this and just save the compute cycles. But I'm going to go ahead and start creating some kind of little city here at the center. So I'm going to drop another geometry node down and just open this up. And we'll drop a box. With the box selected, let's zoom back over here to the origin. So the box is going to be at origin. We can probably pretty much just model this at origin for the most part. I'm going to make this box a little bit bigger, and just so it looks like a building in this camera view here. Maybe that's a little bit too big, so we can make it a little bit narrower. And since this is so far away, we don't need to add a whole lot of detail. We just need to add enough to kind of sell the idea that it's this tall skyscraper. So I'm just going to add some real basic things like a cutter. So we're going to add another box here. And with this box, I'm just going to kind of bring it out like this. So I'm holding shift to stretch both sides out at the same time. Maybe that's a little bit much, so we can bring it back in, bring it back down a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this by 45 degrees around the y-axis. Sure, I put my number in the wrong box. There we go. So we've rotated it, and I'm just going to place it kind of at the base of this building. Now, it's typically best to model everything at origin and then move it where you want it, rather than model it, like position it where you want it and then model it, because then stuff kind of gets complex. So we'll model at origin and then position it where we want it. What I'm going to do is just kind of overlap this a little bit with our box. It's a little bit hard to see what it's doing here, but I'm going to go ahead and drop in a Boolean. And Booleans let us cut things apart or combine things in different ways. And with the Boolean active, I'm going to go ahead and set the visibility on the Boolean. I'm going to change it to subtract, so that it's going to subtract a minus b. And input a here, in this case, which is the box that makes up the building, it's going to subtract box 2. Now I can still go and take box 2 and move it around here. I'll move it out a little bit. So just kind of cutting off one of these corners. Maybe move it up a little bit. Actually, we can go ahead and move it in, and I'm just going to kind of spread this out, maybe make it a little bit taller, just to kind of give it some kind of interest. We want to be able to see it at this distance here. And then I'm going to duplicate this cutter and make it move up. So I'm going to add a duplicate node. And with the duplicate node, this is really handy. We can just tell it how many we want and what direction we want it to move. So by middle mouse clicking and dragging this and moving this up, each iteration is going to move up a certain amount here. So we can basically just kind of take this shape and then add more until it goes up to the very top of the building. And then if I take this original one and do other things with it, maybe move it in a little bit further, we can do all sorts of neat stuff with this to kind of create our basic low-res building. So there's a basic building. We have enough information that we can kind of see that detail there. Now I can take a transform node and position it where I want it. So with that transform node active, we can just kind of bring it down a little bit until it's... So I'm going to go ahead and create another building here using a tube. And with the tube, we'll set it to polygon, and we'll just kind of increase the height. Let's crank that way up, and we'll increase the radius just a bit, kind of like that. And that deselected here. We'll go ahead and hit, and make sure its display flag is on. We'll go ahead and hit T and just kind of move it up a little bit. Right, now I'm also going to kind of do the same thing that I did with the other one. I'm going to use a cutter. This time I'm going to use a torus. And with the torus, let's go ahead and set that visibility and set the this flag so we can see the tube and the torus at the same time. With the torus, we'll go ahead and scale it up as well. So just drag it up like that. These two radii do different things. So this is kind of the radius of the torus itself, and then this radius is of the tube that kind of goes around. So I'm going to make that second radius a little bit smaller. And let's go ahead and start booleaning, or add our boolean here, so that we can join these together. So first tube, and then the torus goes into it. We'll turn off this template so that we can just see these both, and then make sure that this is set to subtract. So it's going to subtract out our torus. Now our torus is still a little bit too big to actually cut into this. So we're going to need to take the central radius down a little bit until it cuts in something like that. Now I can go ahead and go over here and just hit T and kind of move it down. So thing like that. And again, we'll just duplicate it. This is a quick way to get some real basic buildings. So we'll just drag our copy up, something like that. And then we'll add additional copies. That's maybe a few too many, so let's bring it down a little bit. All right, so there we go. There's our additional building. Now our normals are a little bit weird, and obviously we should typically fix our geometry. I'm just going to add a normal to this just to kind of give us some control over it. Again, not as ideal as actually making nice clean geometry. Now I'm just going to take both of these and merge them together. And you could continue doing this and keep adding more and more of these. But for now, I think you get the picture. So we've got our little buildings there, and we'll kind of leave this as is and go ahead and jump into rendering. So I'm going to go back up to the object menu. Before we render this out, we're going to need to create a, let's make sure that our merge is set and add some normals actually at the end here. There we go. All right. So let's jump back up here. So in order to get the atmospheric perspective, I'm going to need to create a cloud. And for the cloud to work, I'm going to need to have something for it to attach to. So I'm going to add a sphere. And with the sphere selected, we are going to go up to the cloud effects and add a cloud rig. And the cloud rig will just automatically attach to the sphere. And the nice thing about it is that it comes with skylight and the sunlight and the cloud itself. Now the problem though is that we need to make it a little bit bigger, and so I'm going to take this sphere, I can grab that, and we're going to scale this way up. We want this cloud to be much bigger than it is right now, and I'm going to scale it up by a factor of 10. I'll zoom way out here in this view, spacebar H to jump out. We're just going to scale it up so it kind of encapsulates the entire environment here. So we're going to go ahead and scale it up just a bit more. So it gets the entire thing. The computer's starting to get a little bit laggy with this, so this will take a little bit of time. So we'll look at our skylight here in a second, but first we want to make sure that the cloud is not quite as strong. Right now it is way too strong. It's like being literally in a cloud. So we're going to take this down a little bit. So I'm going to go into the cloud from sphere, and just to open up this network, it's actually created a whole network in here for us. If I select the cloud 1, we've got a couple of settings that we want to change. First, we don't need this much sampling. That's part of what's slowing down the computer, so I'm going to take that down to around 10, like 7 to 10-ish. You can see that the resolution goes way down, so now it's looking a little bit blocky. Next, I want to take the density way down as well. So we can drag this all the way down here, but it's still quite strong. So probably a good number is going to be around like 0.005 or 0.0005 or something like that. Here in our preview, this is not really an ideal view. It's not giving us a whole lot of information about what this is actually going to look like once rendered. So at this point, we'd probably want to go ahead and jump into the render view and start looking at that. Before I start rendering though, I want to make sure to turn my skylight on, because if I start rendering here, let's go ahead and set our camera and click render, the sky is not going to show up, so we need to make sure that our skylight is set for render light geometry, and that way it'll actually show us the sky, which is helpful. Now this will take a little bit of time while this renders out, but as we make changes, once it's kind of done the base render, then it should update relatively quickly. Mantra isn't the fastest renderer, but it gets things done. So now we can already see that this is probably not going to have enough visibility, but we will need to let it render out a little bit more just to be able to see what's actually at work there. Now, I also want to make sure that my light is set to kind of, set the right mood for the scene. By default, it gives us kind of a noonday sun. So if I select the sunlight here, we've got light color and intensity and exposure and all that good stuff. But down here, if we go down to sun and sky, that gives us control over the angle of the sun and kind of where it's at in the sky. Right now it's at 45 degrees, so not exactly noon, but kind of like afternoon or morning. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. And unfortunately, it's going to be hard to see this while it's rendering because it's going to take a little while for that to happen. But you can see as it gets down closer to the horizon, it starts to get a little bit more like a sunset. You can also rotate the angle that the light is pointing. Right now we've kind of backlit our city, which is not good. So I'm going to go ahead and have this a little bit more off to the side so we can actually see those nice buildings that we made and see some of the detail in them. Now we can kind of get an idea of how much atmospheric perspective is actually there. And in this case, it's actually probably not quite enough. So we're going to need to go in and kind of fine tune this. I'm going to go open up the cloud, and we can go into our density here. And we can actually kind of change the density map so we can make it less dense close up and more dense more quickly as it gets further away. So we can kind of change that so it fades a little bit more quickly, keeping a relatively low density overall. I'm going to go ahead and set this at 009 and let it render and see what we get. But at this point, it's really just kind of playing with the settings until you get a render setting that you're happy with, until you get the look that you're going for. And you'll probably have to tweak your camera and place your camera, and look dev takes a while, and it really just kind of takes tweaking your scene. So that's going to be up to your individual scene. So I won't make you sit here and watch me kind of fiddle with it until it's perfect. But those are the basic things that you'll need to use in order to get that done. Once you're happy with your scene, you'll want to go into the output. So we're going to go back to Object and then change to the Output view. And you're going to want to set up your settings here. Now I recommend using the EXR format since you get a much larger file that you can then go and edit and post. But if you want a small file straight away, and just use the regular Photoshop editing tools, and you can get a PNG. I don't recommend using JPEG because, again, they're lossy. So generally, unless you just want a really, really small file, you can avoid JPEGs. Now, this here, by default, is going to go into the render folder of your set project. If you haven't set your project, you'll probably want to navigate to where you want it to save. So you can click this little button here. Mine is already in my set project here, but if I go up, I can kind of navigate to where I want it to go, put it here in this folder, and we'll just call this the large scale. And we'll call it .png. And just as practice, it's always good to use underscores and be consistent with file names. So we'll click accept for that. So now that we've set a custom location, it'll save it out there for us. Now, some other settings that you'll probably want to check, and I'm going to turn off this auto update here so it doesn't keep re-rendering, because every time we make a settings change, you'll see that it starts to re-render over here. But some other things that you'll probably want to look out for are on the rendering tab, your samples over here. Now, you'll probably want to, if you get a lot of grain or a lot of mess in your render, you'll need to increase your ray samples, those are the light rays that are calculated arriving at the camera. You can also affect adjust the noise level. To reduce noise, you can just crank this noise level down. Now, of course, the lower the noise level, the longer the render will take. You can increase the maximum ray samples, and of course, the more ray samples, the longer the render will take. Now, global quality is going to be a general control for your render, and you can probably bring this up a little bit. Now, in this case, we're not going to be using all of these, so we don't really need to crank everything up. I don't have a whole lot of really complex textures with subsurface scattering or anything like that, but we do have quite a bit of diffuse, and so we'll just want to kind of crank some of these settings up a little bit. I don't have anything refracting, so we can actually take that down a little bit. And I don't have anything reflecting, like metal surfaces or anything like that, so we can take that down a little bit and just kind of prioritize what's in your scene. In this case, I just have a lot of matte material, so really diffuse is going to be the main one that is going to take quite a while. Now, I'm going to go ahead and jump back up here to images. Once you're done and you're ready and you're happy with the render, again, this is, depending on your computer, this can take quite a while, but once you're done and you're happy with it, you can go ahead and click Render to Disk, and that will save a copy of the render out to your computer. So I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, leave them in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.